Did railroads really wake up one day and decide to erase the caboose? Or was something deeper quietly pushing it off the tracks long before anyone noticed? Because what disappeared wasn't some outdated boxcar, it was a moving office, a lookout tower, a home, and the last set of human eyes on thousands of tons of steel racing across the country. And in less than a decade, it was gone almost everywhere at once. For more than 100 years, the caboose sat at the very end of every freight train, like a final checkpoint that never slept, carrying inside it a rhythm of work that felt almost surgical in its precision, where the conductor leaned over a worn desk with stacks of paperwork that defined the train's entire identity, every car logged by hand with its weight, cargo, and destination, a rolling archive that had to match reality perfectly because a single mismatch could trigger fines, delays, or worse. And every time the train stopped, those records were checked again against the physical consist, corrected, rewritten, and confirmed before the wheels ever turned again. Because in a world before digital tracking, that ledger was the truth, and the caboose was where that truth lived. Climb a few steps higher, and the entire purpose of the caboose revealed itself through the cupola, a raised glass perch that gave crews a clear view stretching down the endless line of freight cars, where brakemen rotated shifts, scanning for the smallest signs of danger, a faint trail of smoke curling from a bearing, a sudden flicker of heat from a wheel, or the subtle shift of a load that didn't sit right anymore, because back then freight cars relied on plain bearings that could overheat without warning, and catching that early meant stopping the train before it tore itself apart, while missing it meant derailments that could scatter cars across miles of track. So the routine became instinct, eyes trained to catch what machines didn't even exist to detect yet, ears tuned to abnormal sounds buried under the thunder of steel. The vigilance extended beyond sight alone, because mounted inside the caboose was a pressure gauge tied directly to the air brake line that ran the full length of the train. And every reading mattered. A sudden drop meant something had gone wrong. Somewhere far ahead, a separation, a leak, a failure that needed immediate action, and the conductor would compare those readings with the engineer at the front, coordinating responses without the luxury of instant communication, relying instead on experience and timing, turning what looked like a simple rail car into a nerve center where safety was constantly being measured, checked, and rechecked in real time. Yet the caboose was never only about systems and safety, because beneath all that discipline, it carried something else entirely, a sense of life that made it feel less like equipment and more like a place people actually lived in, where a cast iron stove burned through cold nights, filling the air with heat and the smell of coffee bubbling slowly, while simple meals cooked in battered pans, and along the walls, shelves held tins of food, small personal items, reminders of home that followed the crew across hundreds of miles, while narrow bunks stacked against the side gave them somewhere to rest in between shifts, catching sleep whenever the rhythm of the train allowed it, sharing stories, building routines, turning long journeys into something almost familiar despite the constant motion beneath them. Communication itself carried a kind of language that feels almost impossible today, because before radios became standard, the rear of the train spoke through motion and light. Lanterns swung in precise arcs, each movement carrying meaning that had to be understood instantly by the engineer far ahead. Signals passed through darkness, fog, and snow, reinforced by whistle codes that echoed down the tracks in patterns learned over years, creating a system where two people could coordinate miles apart without ever speaking directly. And even when radios arrived in the 20th century, those habits stayed because they weren't only practical, they were part of the culture that defined railroading. All of this worked because it had to, because the technology to replace it didn't exist yet, but that reality began to shift quietly as the industry evolved, starting with changes that seemed unrelated at first, like the introduction of roller bearings that eliminated the very hot boxes crews were trained to spot, or trackside detectors that could scan passing trains for defects faster and more consistently than human eyes, while computers began to take over the paperwork that once filled entire ledgers in the caboose, and locomotives themselves grew larger and more capable, housing full crews at the front, slowly pulling the center of control away from the rear. Then came the device that would ultimately replace everything the caboose represented, the end-of-train device, or ETD. A compact unit attached to the last car, small enough to look insignificant but powerful enough to redefine how trains were monitored, constantly sampling brake pressure and transmitting that data directly to the engineer in real time, providing continuous updates without fatigue, without distraction, without the limits of human attention, while also adding motion sensors and flashing marker lights that made the rear of the train visible and measurable in ways the caboose never could, turning what was once a human responsibility into a stream of data, moving invisibly through radio signals. What made this shift unstoppable was not only the technology itself, but the numbers behind it, because by the mid-1980s, railroads began running large-scale trials, replacing cabooses with these devices, and the results were immediate and difficult to ignore, with reports showing tens of millions of dollars saved within just a few years, driven by the simple fact that a device costing only a few $1,000s could replace equipment that cost tens of thousands to build and far more to maintain, while also eliminating the wages, overtime, and benefits of the crew members who operated in the rear, turning every train into a calculation where removing the caboose reduced weight, reduced fuel consumption, and reduced long-term operational costs in a way that scaled across entire fleets. The industry didn't need long to act on those numbers because once the economics became clear, adoption spread rapidly, with Union Pacific beginning widespread use of end-of-train devices in 1984, and cabooseless operations expanding across major routes within months. And by the late 1980s, hundreds of cabooses were being retired each year, with records showing dramatic reductions from over 1,000 active cabooses in the mid-1980s to only a fraction of that number within a decade, a decline so fast it felt almost coordinated, even though it was driven by independent decisions across multiple railroads. At the same time, the legal framework that once required cabooses began to fall apart, because for decades, safety regulations had mandated their presence on every freight train. But as technology improved and railroads pushed for change, those laws were gradually relaxed or repealed, including state-level requirements that had kept cabooses in service longer than necessary. Until by the early 1990s, regulators concluded that rear-end telemetry and automated monitoring could replace the traditional safety role of the caboose, effectively removing the final barrier to its disappearance. Not everyone accepted that conclusion, and resistance came quickly from unions representing conductors and brakemen who argued that a machine could measure pressure but could never replicate awareness, pointing out that sensors could not see a shifting load, could not hear the subtle crack of a failing coupler, could not smell overheating equipment before it became visible, and hearings throughout the 1980s were filled with testimonies describing near misses and incidents where human observation had prevented disasters, framing the debate as something larger than efficiency, a question of whether safety could truly be reduced to data alone. Regulators ultimately sided with the numbers because the data collected from pilot programs showed extremely low failure rates for end-of-train devices, and the cost-benefit analyses presented by railroads painted a picture that was hard to argue against. Millions saved annually with no measurable increase in accidents, at least in the datasets available at the time, and once that decision was made, the transition accelerated even further, turning what had been a gradual decline into a near-complete elimination within a span of roughly 15 years. Between the mid-1980s and the end of the 1990s, thousands of cabooses disappeared from active service across the United States, with estimates suggesting that more than 4,000 were retired or repurposed, leaving behind a rail network where the rear of the train, once occupied by people, was now marked only by a blinking red light and a stream of transmitted data, a transformation so complete that newer generations grew up never seeing a caboose in motion at all. Still, the shift raised questions that never fully went away. because while the reliability of these devices remains high, even a small failure rate carries consequences when applied across tens of thousands of trains. And there have been documented cases where loss of telemetry left engineers without critical information until the issue was discovered by chance, highlighting the difference between statistical reliability and absolute certainty. A gap that becomes more significant when the margin for error is measured in miles of moving freight. Outside the United States, the story took a slightly different path, because in several countries, variations of rear-end crew roles continued in certain operations, especially in regions where long distances, extreme climates, or infrastructure limitations made human oversight still valuable, reinforcing the idea that the disappearance of the caboose was not an inevitable outcome of progress, but a decision shaped heavily by economic priorities and regulatory choices specific to one system. Today, the caboose survives mostly in places where motion has stopped, preserved in museums, displayed along quiet tracks, or repurposed into restaurants, cabins, and small homes. Its bright colors and distinctive shape instantly recognizable even to those who never saw one in service, because it represents something more than a piece of equipment. It represents a way of working where safety depended on people physically present at the very end of the train, watching, listening, and reacting in real time. That contrast is what makes its disappearance feel so sudden even decades later, because the replacement did not replicate the experience. It replaced it entirely, trading a human environment filled with routines, smells, conversations, and constant observation for a sealed device that communicates silently through numbers, efficient, precise, and tireless, but fundamentally different in what it means to oversee something as complex as a freight train stretching for miles. In the end, the caboose was not removed because it failed to do its job. It was removed because something cheaper could do enough of that job to satisfy both regulators and balance sheets, and that distinction matters because it reveals how progressism is often defined not by what is lost or gained in human terms, but by what can be measured, reduced, and optimized at scale, leaving behind questions that don't always show up in the data, but still linger in the background of every passing train. And when a blinking red light replaces the last pair of eyes on the track, it raises a quiet question that never fully disappears. How much of safety can truly be automated before something important slips through the cracks, and how much of what we call progress is really a reflection of what we're willing to trade away to achieve it? If this made you see something familiar in a completely different way, stick around, because there are more stories like this where technology didn't only change an industry, it quietly erased an entire way of life.